been listening to Late 20th Century Stomp by Philadelphia-based composer-pianist Adam Berenson. Berenson, who teaches piano at Settlement Music School, writes music that defies easy categorization, combining what he calls the spontaneous composition of jazz with the frozen improvisation of classical. Efforts to wed these two seemingly incompatible forms have occupied composers for years. So what sets Berenson's work apart from previous attempts?
I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. I think everything has been done and that all of the basic statements have been made regarding the interpretation of the standard classical and jazz repertoires. What I think I'm doing is synthesizing my own wide-ranging interests in the most natural way that I can, hoping that my taste will get the balance right. So I trust my instincts. If I love something, it can only be natural to try and work with it in some way, to try and process it through my own filters. If composed music is to have real integrity, I believe that it should retain at least some element of spontaneity, improvisation, and imperfection. And for me, if so-called jazz is to have integrity, it needs to integrate contemporary melodic gestures and harmonic ideas. I'd like to play a few examples to illustrate the stylistic and procedural overlap in my music. First, we'll hear some frozen improvisation as played by the Jack Quartet in my third string quartet. Followed by an excerpt of Lecton 3 from my latest album, Penumbra, which features myself on virtual harpsichord and bassist Scott Barnum improvising, in this case, our complementary compositional approach. And then the last excerpt is Lecton 8, also from the Penumbra album, and it should illustrate the sort of contemporary notion of the accompanist not exactly accompanying, but performing in a kind of alternate reality, some other parallel dimension, you might say.
In a way, classical jazz fusion is like an affair between such polar opposites that one wonders how they manage to tolerate each other at all. Yet Berenson has never viewed their compositional processes as mutually exclusive.
Classical composers and jazz musicians have the same profound instinct. They both want and need to compose. So perhaps we find we can express ourselves more naturally and sincerely by letting the process occur improvisatorily, or perhaps we feel that we need to write ideas down on paper, ruminating in each moment and proceeding one step at a time. We know, for example, that Miles Davis and Charlie Parker spent a lot of time listening to Stravinsky and Debussy. And perhaps one of the ways to facilitate originality in jazz is to not listen to jazz. Duke Ellington told us that jazz was the sound of surprise. And so not only can one not practice surprising, but if one has ultimately succeeded musically, perhaps the result should not sound like what perhaps most of us perceive of as jazz.
Berenson informs his music with elements of his multifaceted background. He's a classically trained pianist who holds a master's in jazz studies from the New England Conservatory, where he studied with Paul Bley. He's a playwright and a screenwriter with a degree from NYU's film school.
Picasso famously said, quote, "The artist is a receptacle for the emotions that come from all over the place, from the earth, from a scrap of paper, from a passing shape, from a spider's web." And I think that's really true. I'm quite certain that I take much of my aural inspiration from, say, the Nordic Ingmar Bergman landscapes, and that somehow I'm able to incorporate most of my musical influences into the work, even if they come from apparently totally disconnected sources. The composer-creator will create with anything at hand. Give a musician a piece of wood, and he or she will create something compelling with it. The creative instinct will find expression wherever and however it can.
By all accounts, Berenson is succeeding. He has 20 albums to his credit. His album Lumen, released in 2014, has received favorable reviews from both jazz and classical music critics. So what's next?
The wonderful Spanish ensemble Trio Arbos will be premiering a piano trio that I wrote for them titled Lamben Fragments in North America in 2018 at locales and at venues to be determined. And I also just completed a large work for full orchestra titled Aras, which I'm shopping around at the moment. So I can't wait for opportunities to come to me. I have to keep working, following inspirations and instincts. I always have, and I hope that I always will.
Thank you, Adam, for speaking with us. I'm Christine Facciolo for WHYY.